Access to adequate and affordable housing has long been a concern in cities such as Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, the three main port of entries for new immigrants and refugees in the country. More than 2/3 of all immigrants and refugees arriving in this country, they choose Montreal, Toronto, and or Vancouver. It is also an increasing issue in the growing outer suburbs of major metropolitan areas, where the supply of affordable housing and immigrant settlement services is limited. So what I want to say is we have already a problem of affordable housing in these three main cities, but the problem is worst in the outer suburbs of Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. So within this context, I choose the cities of Surrey and Richmond. They are two outer suburbs of Vancouver. This paper explores the housing experiences and coping strategies of immigrant renters in the rental housing market in Surrey and Richmond. I used the Smith Structured Questionnaire Survey with 90 questions. It was a long questionnaire survey with questions dealing with the socio-demographic profile of those immigrant renters, housing issues, housing services they used or not in the suburbs, questions about their current housing situation, questions dealing with Surrey and Richmond as welcoming communities, and last but not least, one section of the survey dealt with policy recommendations. For those who are not familiar with Surrey and Richmond, they are two new suburbs of Vancouver. And one thing that makes these two suburbs interesting and a good study area is the fact that in the case of Surrey, close to 50%, 50, are members of visible minorities from South Asia, from China, as well as the Philippines. In Richmond, the percentage of members of visible minorities, as we define them here according to the Canadian census data, visible minorities means non-whites, is 65%. So close to 50% in Surrey and 65% in Richmond are members of visible minorities, which makes these two study areas quite unique. In terms of data collection, my study took place during the summer of 2011. As I mentioned before, I used Smith Structured Questionnaire surveys, and 62 renters, 62 recent immigrant renters, immigrants that arrived in the country for the last 10 years, 62 in total, I said, 30 in Richmond and 32 in Surrey participated in this long questionnaire survey. Most people were recruited through local immigrant serving agencies in these two cities. 2 words about the participants, about the 62 recent immigrant renters. Most of these participants, they came from China, from Africa, Korea, and or from Southeast Asia. All participants, as I mentioned, they were recent immigrants. They arrived in the last decade. They arrived with their families. Most were married. Highly educated group of immigrants. Close to 80% of them had an university degree and or a college degree. Now I move to some of those tables that I have here with me. I have only 10 minutes, so I will try my best to summarize some of those tables. The first table that I have in my study deals with the housing situation and the expectations before coming to Canada, as well as their settlement experiences in the suburbs. I will start by mentioning that before these immigrants came to Canada, they lived in big cities back home. They 2/3 owned a single detached home. When I asked them about their housing expectations before coming to Canada, this close to 50%, they expected cheaper housing and better quality housing. In terms of community resources, close to 2/3, they knew someone, relatives, friends, already established in the city of Richmond and Surrey. After arriving in Richmond and Surrey, most rented a residence. Some co-shared or co-owned, I should say, co-rented with someone, with a friend and or with a relative, and very few lived in an emergency shelter, only 6.5%. When I asked them about the reasons for choosing Surrey and Richmond, the reason number one was to live near family members, followed by better quality life and job opportunities. If I try to summarize the settlement experiences in these two cities, I can tell you that group housing was very important. In other words, initially, most of my respondents, they shared residence with relatives and or with friends from the same ethnic background. And they were very helpful, providing them with housing for 1 week, 1 day, 1 month before they got established. Only a few relied on settlement services to find housing when they arrived in Richmond and Surrey, and they got little support from the government on arrival, also finding jobs and housing. Also, this group of respondents, they were highly disappointed with the fact that high levels of education do not necessarily translate into good jobs. Most respondents that I interviewed, they were not satisfied with the type of jobs, low paying, they had. Also, the non-recognition of their credentials was a major problem, which ultimately affects their integration into a new society. If I move to another table here dealing with their current housing situation in the city, I would like to let you know that most live in an apartment and or in a basement suite to save money. Comfortably, 72%, they said that they are comfortable living where they are. However, with regard to the state of repair, close to 35% mentioned that their dwellings needs minor repairs or major repairs. When I asked them a key question, the percent of income they spend on housing, wow, I found that 90% of all respondents are spending more than 30% of their income in housing. This is not good news. According to CMHC, we can say that these people are in core housing need. They are spending too much money of their income in housing. Due to the fact that subsidized housing is almost non-existent and the waiting lists are so long, when I asked them if they had plans to go to subsidized housing, a lot of them said, I would like to, but it takes 6, 7, 10 years before I get subsidized housing, which is a major issue. On the reasons for moving to their present residence, for those who moved, they mentioned that housing costs, rents too expensive, were the major reason for moving residents, followed by the housing conditions and also the number of children they had, and they needed larger homes. So housing costs, rents too expensive, quality of housing, and housing conditions, as well as the number of children, are reasons that lead these people to become mobile and to move frequently to readjust. With regard to the housing search, it was a difficult, stressful experience for most of these immigrants. They declared very stressful the experience, and when I asked why, they mentioned low incomes compared to high rents, housing costs, or lack of in-depth and reliable housing information about the local rental housing markets, and discrimination by landlords. In terms of housing barriers, when I asked for the most important reasons for the barriers they faced, discrimination became an important one. In fact, 54.8% they faced discrimination when they were in search of affordable housing. When I asked for the reasons for housing discrimination, income level or source of income was the number one reason, followed by family size, the number and age of children, the race, ethnicity, cultural and or national background, and language or accent were major barriers that these people faced when they were looking for housing. Now I go to the last part of my presentations. Again, I have to be short, dealing with recommendations. There is need for more aggressive, wider distribution of housing as well as job information by the Canadian government overseas and for immigrants upon arrival in Canada. Point 2. There is an urgent need for more involvement by all levels of government to provide more funding for affordable housing, for profit and non-profit, in the cities of Richmond and Surrey. What about the role of the nonprofit sector? More dialogue is needed between governments and the private sector. Also, it's important to legalize basement suites, which will improve the quality of housing and tenants' rights. Also, education, better information, and more laws against discrimination in the rental housing market. Also important, as we need more comprehensive housing information, which should be available by the government and community organizations, non-government organizations. Information related to housing prices, rents, vacancy rates, workshops for newcomers to help them, to guide them, housing website in different languages, and legislation, strong legislation to protect not only tenants, but also landlords' rights and responsibilities. In sum, there is an urgent need for more community organizations, for more settlement services specializing in the provision of ethno-specific settlement services, including housing programs. Those organizations, they need what I call housing specialists. Last but not least, future research. There is need to examine the housing histories of immigrant groups and compare immigrants' experiences as well as coping strategies with their experiences in other outer suburbs of major Canadian cities, including in small and mid-sized cities. Thank you.